Lonely rancher gets 24-year-old widow pregnant. Then her secret changes everything. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind rolled low across the Montana plains, pulling dust from the earth and carrying it toward the pale horizon. Eli Mercer sat on the porch of his cabin, his elbows resting on his knees, the brim of his hat shadowing a face worn by sun and silence. His land stretched wide 50 acres of stubborn soil and hard memory. He'd buried his brother 3 winters ago after a stampede that neither of them saw coming. Since then, the ranch had gone quiet, and so had Eli. Some said grief made him mean. Others said he'd just stopped seeing the point in talking to a world that only took. When the wind rose that night, he didn't bother latching the door. Let it blow, he thought. Nothing left inside that could break, but the wind brought more than dust. It brought the faint sound of hooves, uneven and desperate, drawing closer until a horse stumbled into the yard, side slick with sweat. A woman clung to the reins, her hair wild and face pale. Eli stood, reaching the porch rail just as she slid from the saddle. He caught her before she hit the ground. I just need a place to stop," she whispered. "Please." Her voice cracked on the word. Eli looked toward the dark horizon, then down at her soaked skirt and trembling hands. "You're half frozen," he said. "Come inside." The rain came heavy then, as if the sky had been waiting for her to fall. By the time the fire took hold in the hearth, her teeth had stopped chattering. She sat wrapped in an old quilt, her boots drying near the door. Eli poured coffee into a tin mug and handed it to her. "Name's Mercer," he said quietly. "Lydia Harrow," she replied, fingers curling around the cup. "My wagon broke crossing the creek." The horse bolted and she looked down. "I've been walking since noon," Eli nodded. "You can rest here tonight. I'll ride out come morning and see what's left." "Thank you," she murmured. Silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of wet logs. She studied the room, a single bed, a small table, shelves lined with tools and canned beans. It looked like a place a man had stopped trying to make comfortable long ago. Her eyes found the photograph on the mantel. 2 boys, both young, both smiling. "Your brother?" Eli's hand paused mid-motion with the poker. "Was," he said. The word hung there, final and cold. That night, when Lydia finally lay on the cot he'd set near the fire, Eli stayed up watching the flames, wondering why a woman her age, barely 24, maybe was traveling alone through a country that chewed up the unprepared. Lydia stayed. At first it was only until her wagon could be salvaged. But spring turned to early summer, and the trail to town flooded out, leaving her stranded at the Mercer ranch. Eli put her to work with the same quiet practicality he applied to his own life. She helped mend fences, learned to milk the cows, and took to the kitchen like she'd been born to it. She moved through the cabin like sunlight through an old window, soft but steady, warming things he didn't know were still capable of thawing. By the 2nd month, the town had begun to whisper. Widow Harrow, living out on Eli Mercer's ranch. Folks remembered her husband, a gambler who'd died with more debts than honor. The stories grew fast and mean. Lydia ignored them, or tried to. But Eli saw the tension in her shoulders each time she rode to town for supplies. "They'll talk," he said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his neck. "They already do," she answered, tightening the reins on her mare. "And I'm too tired to care." Still, when she looked at him, her eyes said she wished she could. The summer storm came sudden and fierce. Lightning split the sky, and by the time Eli reached the barn, sparks had already leapt from the hayloft. He shouted for Lydia, and together they worked through smoke and rain, driving the terrified horses into the open. When the last one bolted free, Lydia stumbled, coughing, her skirt catching a glowing ember. Eli tackled her into the mud, smothering the flame with his own coat. By morning, the barn was gone, so was most of the feed, and Lydia had taken a fever. Eli sat by her bedside for 2 nights straight, changing wet cloths on her forehead, spooning water to her lips. He didn't pray, but he thought about it. When she finally woke, she reached weakly for his hand. "You saved me," she whispered. "Seems you've saved me right back," he said, his voice rougher than the words deserved. After that, they didn't talk much, but something unspoken changed. The quiet between them grew less like absence and more like understanding. By autumn, the first frost touched the edges of the fields. Lydia's cheeks had color again, and Eli had learned to smile, a small reluctant thing that felt foreign on his face. They shared meals now, talked a little in the evenings. But when she rode into town for flour, the gossip struck harder than ever. "Mercer's keeping her out there for company," Mrs. Dawson hissed behind the counter. No preacher's paper between them. Lydia didn't answer. She simply paid and left. But she rode home slower that day, the words clinging like burrs. That night she told him she'd go come spring, that she didn't want to cause trouble for him. Eli looked up from sharpening his knife, the lamplight cutting across his face. "You think I care what they say? I think you've been alone long enough to forget what it costs," she replied quietly. He said nothing after that, just stared into the fire until the blade gleamed like silver. The first snow came early. Lydia spent the morning splitting kindling, refusing to rest even when her hands blistered. Eli noticed she'd grown paler in recent days, her appetite gone. That afternoon she fainted in the yard. He caught her just before she hit the frozen ground. When she woke, she looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Eli, there's something I didn't tell you." He sat on the edge of her bed, jaw tight. "I'm with child," she whispered. The world seemed to still. "It happened before my husband died," she said. "No one in town knew. He left me with nothing but this." Her hands trembled against her stomach. "I thought it was over, that I'd lost it." But Eli stood pacing once before he stopped at the window. Snow fell soft and relentless outside. Finally he turned back. "You don't owe me shame for surviving," he said. Her breath hitched. "You're not angry?" He shook his head. "You've got life growing in you. That's something this land could use more of." But outside, the wind howled like it already knew what the town would say. The news spread faster than a prairie fire. Widow Harrow, living with Eli Mercer and carrying a child. By week's end, Eli found himself facing down 3 men from town: the sheriff, the storekeeper, and Reverend Cole. "You've brought shame on this town," the Reverend said. "The woman's with child under your roof." "It ain't right." Eli's jaw worked slowly. "You came all this way to tell me how to tend my house?" "She'll be cast out," the sheriff warned. "You'll both lose what little standing you've got left." Eli stepped closer until the lamplight caught the edge of his stare. "You think standing's worth more than decency? You can all go to hell." When they left, Lydia stood behind the door, trembling. "They'll never forgive us," she said. "Then let 'em choke on their forgiveness," he muttered. It wasn't defiance that kept them together after that. It was something stronger, a quiet decision that neither would face another winter alone. Spring came slow and wet. The ground thawed and the creek swelled, breaking free of its ice. Lydia's belly rounded, her steps slower now. Eli worked longer hours, patching the roof, building a new crib with his own hands. He never said much, but every stroke of the plane across the wood carried meaning. The night the baby came, thunder rolled across the plains. Eli rode hard to fetch the midwife, but the river had risen too high. He returned soaked and breathless. Lydia's cries filled the cabin. "I can't," she gasped. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice firm but kind. "You're the strongest person I know." When the child's cry finally broke through the storm, Eli sank to his knees beside the bed, his face buried in his hands. Lydia smiled weakly. "It's a boy," he looked at her, eyes shining. "He's yours, Lydia, always will be." Weeks later, the midwife finally made it out from town. After a quiet examination, she frowned slightly and asked for a word outside. Eli stepped out with her, the afternoon sun warm on the porch. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly. "The boy, his eyes, they're not of the same color, one brown, one blue." Eli's stomach knotted. The midwife hesitated. "There was a man in town, of a lawman, who had eyes just like that. He died not long before Lydia's husband. Some folks said—" Eli raised a hand. "I don't need to hear it." That night, Lydia confessed through tears. "It wasn't my husband," she whispered. "It was a marshal who helped me when my husband beat me. I thought I'd never see him again. I never meant to lie." Eli looked at her for a long time. "You didn't lie," he said finally. "You survived. That's not the same." He touched the baby's cheek, small and perfect. "A man's past ain't what makes him. It's what he builds after." And in that moment, whatever shame had lived between them dissolved into something steadier. Not forgiveness, but grace. By the next summer, the Mercer ranch had changed. The fences stood strong, the fields grew green again, and laughter, soft and rare, had returned to the cabin. Lydia hung linens in the sun while Eli taught the boy to stand in the grass. In town, the whispers faded. Some said Eli had found peace, others said the widow had tamed him. But those who rode past the ranch saw something different. Two people who'd carved a life from the same hard land that had nearly broken them both. At sunset, Eli stood beside Lydia, their child cradled between them, the sky burning gold. "You ever wish you'd taken another road?" he asked quietly. She smiled. "Not once." And when the wind rose again, it no longer sounded like loneliness, but the wide, living breath of a place finally forgiving its own.